as Thomas de Tosnu Rish, le Oakleron Sinn Féin, and Shachta MaryLou McDonald.
I'm not who I'm supposed to be. I was robbed of the chance to meet the woman who gave birth to me. I don't know who I am. Taoiseach, these are voices of people affected directly by the scandal of illegal adoption in this state. Some will feature in a documentary tonight on RTE Investigates. The news that the Department of Children has now confirmed at least 151 illegal adoptions at the St Patrick Guild Adoption Society in Dublin is deeply upsetting. However, it has to be said that it's not surprising. You see, successive governments have known of these scandals for decades, and yet they failed to name them and to act, despite ample documentary evidence. Indeed, campaigners have been raising issues with successive governments since at least 2002. And over the years, the Adoption Rights Alliance has raised specific issues of illegal adoption with successive ministers, but it was only in 2018 that we began to see some movement. So this St Patrick's audit is only the tip of the iceberg. It's widely considered that thousands of children were illegally adopted, some trafficked to America and to elsewhere, and that hundreds of institutions across the state were involved in these practices. Indeed, it is being reported that the government review has found evidence of illegal adoption in multiple organisations. So, Taoiseach, we now need a transparent, inclusive investigation into Ireland's adoption system as a whole, because this was yet another massive failure and massive abuse by the state in its treatment of women and children. It was deliberate and it was criminal. Children had their identities erased through the falsification of their birth certificates. Their most basic right was stolen, the right to know who you are, to know where you came from. There are people who are illegally adopted but have no idea that they were adopted. Many have lived for decades unaware of their identities and without access to their records. So many will want to know who their birth parents are, and now it may be too late. This was the case for Anne O'Connor, who in 2019 received a letter from Tusla requesting a meeting with her. Anne met with them in London, where she now lives, and she was told that she had been illegally adopted. She was told that her parents who had passed away weren't her birth parents, that her birthday isn't her birthday, and that she wasn't born where she thought she was born. And that revelation rocked Anne to her very core. She said that there was loss everywhere. There was something about not knowing this. She's 65. It's too long. She says, I wasn't who I thought I was, but I don't know who I am. Taoiseach, all adopted people are entitled to know who they are. So the state needs to end the discrimination against all adopted people in accessing their personal records. This means introducing information and tracing legislation as soon as possible. But foremost, it means passing legislation that will give all adopted people a legal right to obtain a copy of their birth certificate. Tá an reachtaíocht seo fáilte ag Sinn Féin, tuairfear an bille os córa na dála an seachtain sehuaing, bhí córa cuideach ag mo cóglachaí Catherine Funchen leis an ara ó Gorman a híisi, an nealfaí tú tacu leis an reachtaíocht seo. Sinn Féin has published this legislation, Ceann Comhairle. We'll bring the bill before the Dáil next week, and I'm asking you, Taoiseach, to commit to supporting this legislation as a first step to right these wrongs.
Well, first of all, Ceann Comhairle, I want to thank the Deputy for raising this issue, which is a very, very serious issue, and I am aware that RT Primetime Investigates is due to air a programme this evening focusing on the St Patrick's Guild illegal birth registrations, which is shocking in terms of the illegality of what took place, and particularly for those affected, the trauma, the anguish, the hurt that people are now experiencing as a result of this unacceptable practice. Because what happened was wrong, plain and simple, and completely unacceptable. An enormous trauma has been placed on people as a result of this illegality. The government is committed, as the Deputy knows, to introducing information and tracing legislation as a priority, because the people involved in this particular, the victims here, had been approached by TUSLA and essentially told, you are not who you thought you were, or your parents are not those who you thought they were, and you don't know who you are now, or who your parents are, and you can't get access to the most basic of information that any human being should have access to. So the priority has to be information and tracing legislation. The Minister for Children is working on that with the Attorney General's office to provide comprehensive legislation which will provide access to birth information, including the birth certificate, for individuals and for anyone who has a question in relation to their identity and indeed origins. And more broadly, the Minister for Children has also established an interdepartmental working group to identify the issues which have now arisen for many of the affected victims here and individuals, to propose solutions for them. And those solutions will then form the basis of consultation with those affected by these illegal birth registrations. You know that back in 2018, a sampling review into illegal birth registrations was commissioned by the then government to identify whether there were markers on files to indicate a practice of illegal birth registrations in the records of other adoption agencies and similar institutions as was found on the St. Patrick's Guild files. The previous minister appointed an independent reviewer to oversee the process. The publication of the sampling review had to await the final report of the Mother and Baby Home Commission, as it encroached on the work of that commission. Now that the Commission has published its report, it is intended to publish the sampling review shortly, and I think the Minister will be bringing a memo to Government in relation to the sampling review next week, is the intended timeline for that. And the files at St. Patrick's were unique insofar as there were markers on the file, indicating that children were adopted from birth. And as we know, TUSLA workers, social workers, are continuing the work of informing people that their birth was illegally registered, arising from markers found in the St. Patrick's Guild files. The number of confirmed cases, as the Deputy said, has increased from 126 to 151 since the announcement in May 2018. The primary issue raised, my understanding of one of the primary issues that will be raised this evening is again the lack of information for the individuals in question and the difficulties in accessing records and understandable anger and frustration is clearly being felt. But I just want to say that we are very, very committed as a matter of urgency to bring in comprehensive legislation on information and tracing once and for all to deal with this issue.
Okay, good Margaret.
Ceann Comhairle, and Taoiseach, indeed, these matters are deeply traumatising and deeply upsetting, but they're not surprising. You see, that's the point. There has been knowledge of these practices which were deliberate and which were criminal for a very considerable length of time. And now we need to put things to rights. There's the scandal of illegal adoption itself, the scandal of the trafficking of children to America and elsewhere, and then the ongoing scandal to rub salt into the wound of the state and agencies of the state deliberately blocking and frustrating adopted people in accessing their information. Perhaps that's the biggest scandal of all, and it persists to this day. So yes, we need information and tracing legislation, Taoiseach, and that legislation has to put the adopted person first. Their rights front and centre. But in the meantime, we have legislation in respect of access to birth certificates. We will bring it next week, and I am appealing to you, Taoiseach, to follow in the steps of Minister Gorman, who has been very constructive on this matter, and to support this legislation as an immediate and a necessary first step to put things right.
Could I say, Deputy, you know the government is bringing in such legislation, and you know that the government legislation has been fully informed comprehensively and from a comprehensive legal perspective with the Attorney-General. So I would ask you perhaps to await for the government legislation to be published, and that all parties in the House, in a spirit of cooperation, could work on that legislation, which is being formulated to essentially give that access in terms of access to birth information and to the birth certificate, and very basic information in terms of identity that every individual and every human being, in my view, is entitled to. The last Dáil attempted to do this. The last Dáil was not in a position to achieve consensus on this when the previous Minister for Children brought forward legislation. There's an opportunity now on a cross-party basis to once and for all deal with this in terms of the access to information, and I think that should be done in a non-partisan way, because I think we all want to do not just the right thing, but that which I think all parties have articulated a similar view. The Minister has given an indicative timeline. By the end of March, he'll have the legislation, and it's complex, but he's determined to do it.